Hello, everyone. Welcome back to U.S. history. So, today we're starting our next unit with learning what the causes of the Great Depression were. So, we ended with the 1920s, and of course, we end with a major event, the stock market crash, that is one of the leading forces of that. But you would be wrong to actually think that that was the only thing that caused the Great Depression to happen. So, we're going to look at what the Great Depression was, what really a economic depression is in the first place, and then what were the multiple factors that led to our worst economic event ever in history happening way back when. Here we go. Okay, so first we just need to know what was the Great Depression. So, just in terms of defining this, it was the worst economic disaster in modern American history, and it lasted for about 4 years, the reverberations of which would go on after that. Just in terms of defining this as an economic event, 4 years long. But I mean, that's like your high school career, so that's a long time. Now, some things to know. Economic disasters had occurred before, and when we look at US history, they typically happened every 3 years or so. So the economy would increase, decrease, increase, decrease. And what happened throughout our history, all the way up to the Great Depression, was that the government never intervened. So they never took steps to try to address it, to help the average person, or try to change what was going on. They just accepted that this is what happens in the economy. The economy gets better, it gets worse, but it's going to get better on its own. There's no point in the government doing anything about it. Now, like I said before, the Great Depression occurred for many interrelated factors. So it was not just the stock market crashing, it was all these other economic things going on that led to, again, the worst situation our economy has ever been in. Now, if any just one of these things happened, we would have had a bad economy, but they all happened at once, and that's one reason the Great Depression was so bad. So, people were buying on credit and couldn't pay it back, so money was lost. We looked at the stock market crash. People were borrowing money to buy stocks they couldn't pay back. The market was overvalued, it crashed. People were borrowing all that money from banks that then wasted people's money that then they couldn't give back to the people whose money it actually was. And we're going to see how we had a big agricultural disaster just a couple years into the Depression that made everything worse. And like I said, all these factors got worse at the same time. Any one of them happening in a negative way would have been bad for our economy, but we might have got out of it in, just a year or two. But this lasted for so long, and in some, it was so great because it affected every part of our economy, and as a result, it affected everyone of every socioeconomic status, so no one was immune from the effects of the Great Depression. Now, those pictures on the right that I've included for you just show you that process of the economy going up and down across the years. The Great Depression, if we actually get a little cursor over here, is this huge dip right there. So notice that it's bigger than any sort of depression or recession that happened up to this point. I'm going to talk about what some of those words mean next. Here we go. Okay, so I know this is a little bit painful and this isn't an economics class, but we do have to understand some of this terminology in order to move forward. So what you need to know is that the economy goes through something known as the business cycle. And that's what the picture is immediately to the right. I'll explain what that means. So what this means is that there are times when the economy, it's going great. It's expanding. There are more jobs, more products, more money involved, and everything's roaring and working out, just like it was in the 1920s, right? So, an expansion is an era of economic prosperity in which people have jobs, which means they have money to afford to buy the new things that the companies make. The companies then make more money so they can hire more people who have more jobs, who can then go buy more things. Notice, it's kind of like this vicious circle that when the economy is going well, it does extremely well. But the reverse is also true, which is that the economy cannot sustain that expansion forever. So it cannot just continually increase on and on and on forever. That's going to happen where things start to kind of top out, where people are like, I don't need to buy any more of this product. I need to save some money. But companies are still making more than they can really sell. And so what happens is it hits that peak, and then we enter a recession where suddenly companies have to lay people off from their jobs because they don't need their labor anymore. People don't have jobs, people don't have money, so then they can't buy things, and the whole situation just gets worse and worse. So when we look over here, I put it on yours here, is that green area there is known as the expansion. So what this means is that the economy is expanding over time. And when it's really expanding, we call it that boom. What happens though is it peaks out and then we enter a recession in red right here, which means that economically things are not going well. People aren't buying things, people are losing their jobs, and it's very difficult to reverse that process to get into an era of recovery. But the thing about the business cycle is that as we had done for hundreds of years in our country before, we sort of accepted that it just goes through this process again and again. And so without the government getting involved, the markets would correct themselves. Okay, so just so you know, the way we measure the business cycle is something called GDP. It stands for Gross Domestic Product. And it's just a measure of how much stuff our country is making. Now, if that's increasing, that's good. Our economy is doing well. We're selling more, right? But if it decreases, it means our country and the economy as a whole is not selling what it used to. And so that decrease is like the economy receding, like shrinking, instead of expanding and growing. So the key words there that you should know is that expansion, good economy, recession, bad economy. Now, you're like, well, this isn't the Great Recession, it's the Great Depression. Why do we call something a depression? A recession that lasts a long time and affects every part of the economy, so people's jobs, the price of goods, how loans are being given out, all this stuff, that is known as a depression. So depressions don't happen often. Recessions happen more often. Depressions are rare, and the Great Depression was the rarest of the rare. Okay, so what we need to look at are the major negative economic factors that led to the Great Depression being so bad. So it kind of goes in like a process of step 1, step 2, step 3, etc. And the first one we have to recognize is that the U.S. was overproducing goods in about the lead up to the Great Depression. So we have studied industrialization. We studied the growth of the U.S. as a world power in the 1920s, and all through this era, we became a world economic powerhouse, right? The 1920s were roaring with economic activity. All these new things you could buy, like vacuums and cars. That's why I put those pictures there. So what that meant is our economy was doing so great. But when companies see that something sells well, they want to sell as much of it as they can to make more money. But eventually what happens is they make more goods they can actually sell. Like, who needs more than one vacuum, right? So what happens is because they're not selling it, they just wasted a bunch of money on creating something that's not selling. If they can't sell it, they can't make money to pay their workers, and you can see how creating too much of something that's good is going to result in some negative influences on the economy if you don't make good decisions along the way. Something to understand as well is that in economics, when there's a lot of something available, prices decrease. So it means it's easier to get, so there's more competition. And because we were making so many more new goods, prices decreased. So companies tried to sell more at the decreased price to make more money, but then they made more goods than they could actually sell. So notice, there's all these goods being made that couldn't sell, and so companies were hit with hard times right around the time of the Great Depression. Now, that's kind of on the number one thing there is kind of on the end of who's making the goods, but what about the people buying the goods? Now, a second negative economic factor that led to the Great Depression was that increasingly, average Americans were buying goods on credit. So credit means buy now, pay later, or give us a little bit of money now and pay the rest in installments over time. It's essentially how credit cards work, right? But what happened in the 1920s is there were so many more goods people could buy, and banks were offering that people could buy things on credit. So people did that because it was legal. It seemed like it was allowed because it was allowed. Now, what really happens when you buy something on credit is that you get the good, right? You got the thing you really wanted, but it's a bank that is paying the money to the company, and then you pay back the bank. And the bank is using money that they had in their funds from other people to pay that company on your behalf. So what happened is people were buying things they couldn't afford and they couldn't afford to pay off. They couldn't pay back the loans. So Notice this: companies are hurting because they think people want to buy all these things, when in fact, people really couldn't afford it in the first place because everything was being bought on credit, which means that the money was only in one place at once, but people were thinking it was in more than one place at once, right? So companies were hurting, and the average American spender was hurting as well. Moving forward, more negative economic factors. What we want to look at next is something I alluded to a second ago, and that's how the banking system worked. And the way we can describe this is it was unregulated, which means there were basically no rules telling banks what they could and couldn't do. Now, this happened because in the 1920s, the Republican Party controlled the United States federal government for, let me think, maybe like all but 1 year of the 1920s, and the Republican Party was very much in favor of capitalism with no government intervention. So they wanted banks to do whatever they wanted because they thought that was good for the economy. But what happened is the banks made decisions about what to do with the money that people put in their banks. Now, when you put money into a bank, you think it just sits there, and that's definitely not what happens. And that's what that picture to the right shows. You put money into the bank, and then the bank loans it out to people, loans it to people for houses, cars, credit for small purchases, and back then, buying stocks on the stock market, right? So the bank is essentially using your money to do things they want to do. They know you don't need all your money at the moment because it's in savings. It's supposed to just sit there and be pretty, right? But they use it for other purposes. But what happens when they loan it to people who can't pay back what they owe? That is what happened in the unregulated banking system in the 1920s that led to the Great Depression. This money was being put out into the world, and then the people who borrowed it were like, well, I can't afford this, but the bank is letting me do it, so it must be fine. All right, and all that culminates in the thing we actually already studied a little bit, which had to do with the stock market. Essentially, the stock market was overvalued because we learned this term, people were buying stocks on the margin. The rule back then, more or less, was you could put down 10% of the money, borrow the other 90% of the money to buy a share in a company, and then you could say you owned the share, and you would always hope that you would pay off what you borrowed after you made money on the stock market, right? Well, what happened is as time went on, smarter people earlier on figured out that the money wasn't really there, right? That banks were using average people's money to stick into the stock market. Companies thought they were doing so well. People who owned the stocks thought they were doing so well. And the other people thought their money was still in the bank, but it couldn't be in three places at once. That's when the stock market crashed in October 1929. And as a result, those people that still owed money to the banks for those stock loans couldn't pay it back, and their stocks were valueless. And the banks had lost all that money that people had put into savings, thinking that this is for me in retirement, this is for me later on, and they gave it out to a bunch of people to spend it irresponsibly. Remember in class, I basically told you the stock market's kind of like legal gambling. That's what they use the money for. And as a result, that triggered in the banking system and the credit system and the overproduction system. So yes, the stock market crashing was kind of like the spark, right? But all the other things were the underlying causes that were triggered by the stock market crashing. Okay, so let's look at what the immediate result of all this stuff was on our economy. So one of the first things to happen is that we stopped trading with the rest of the world for goods and products. So we were no longer buying goods that other countries were making, right? Because we didn't have money to buy them. Nor were we making goods to sell to other countries because companies were failing in the US. So we weren't making the things as we were before. So what this shows you is that the Great Depression was not just an American United States thing. It was affecting the entire world. It was kind of triggered by our economy, but we were involved with all these countries with trade now after World War I, and that led to this depression becoming a worldwide thing. What happens as well is businesses could no longer operate, right? If people don't have the money to buy stuff, then businesses really can't sell things anymore, which means they then lay off their workers, so people lose their jobs. What we see in the immediate fallout of the Great Depression, 100,000 businesses had to shut down. So we're talking small businesses, people that owned them, and that was their sort of entire way of making money. What we see happen as a result is unemployment reached 35%. That's over a third of the country that should have been able to work no longer was working. that number is usually supposed to be around 5%, so that is not a good sign. In short, neither the business owners nor the workers had money to pay their bills or do what they were supposed to do. If we look at this graph that I put here for you, notice this shows the rate of people that are unemployed. And notice it's going up and down because we have recessions, right? We have expansions. But this is the Great Depression right here, where it absolutely skyrocketed to where it had never been before. Okay, so on top of all this, the banks started failing. If you've heard the word bankrupt before, well, it has the word banked in it, and kind of like the word rupture, to burst. The bank burst its bubble and essentially lost all this customer savings. What was left, people would do things called runs on the bank, and those are all those people you see in the picture there going to the bank to demand their money that they thought the bank was taking care of, and the bank had lost it. In addition, there was no insurance on your deposits. That exists today because of the Great Depression. When your money was gone, it was gone. There was no legal recourse to say, this bank mismanaged my money, you owe it to me. They did not owe it to you. There were no regulations. Okay? So people committed suicide because of this stuff, because they'd worked their entire lives and then the bank lost all their money, and so it was just gone. All right, so you can see all these causes are really horrible for our economy. The immediate results are bad enough. And then we had another disaster on top of that. This, however, was essentially an ecological disaster. So we're talking about what happened after a long time of mismanaging the land where we were growing our crops. And that happened just a couple years into the Great Depression. And it is known as the Dust Bowl. So what we can look at this is that for about 50 years before this, people had been moving into the Great Plains in the middle of America. So we're talking like Nebraska and Kansas and the Dakotas in that area. What happens though is they were getting that land and trying to grow crops like corn, like wheat. Those crops were not native to those areas. They weren't meant to grow there. The soil didn't adapt to grow those. So what happened is that the soil in those areas weren't made to grow those crops. The farmers didn't rotate their crops in order to try to make sure the soil wasn't stressed. And there were also weather cycles in those areas like tornadoes and all that stuff that would really mess with how crops were grown. So there was an era of drought, so not enough water to grow the crops, bad weather cycles, bad farming practices. So what we get in the early 1930s is the soil in the middle of America could no longer grow the crops, and it essentially made the land useless. Storms would blow through, take away any good soil, and there would be these massive dust storms that would travel across the country. If you look at the picture, you can see this one right here. It says approaching dust storm in the Middle West. One of these dust storms was so big and so bad, it started in the Great Plains, and it made it all the way to Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. And that's when the government finally said, oh, now it is our problem. What happened because of this, though? This was the area where the nation grew the crops that people consumed. Corn, wheat, used to make bread, all this stuff. It was essential to people having food, and so there were food shortages as a result. And also there was a big fallout for those people that used to be farmers. They couldn't grow crops anymore. So they were out of a job, a way of life, so they just abandoned their land and their houses and migrated to other places in the country where they hoped to find better conditions, where there might be land that they could farm and use their skills. A lot of them went to California, but what they found once they got there was that the Great Depression was everywhere. I told you, it affected everyone of every economic standing. So Californians really resented having all these people from Oklahoma and the Great Plains coming in and trying to interfere in their land and being an extra burden on them. So what we see is the Great Depression had all these causes. It had some pretty bad fallout at first. And so what we get by the early 1930s is the whole nation is suffering. Economically, socially, and politically, the government's doing absolutely nothing about it because they said, hey, we've never done anything about this in the past. Why should we change now? Now, we're going to see a little bit later on how the government does change its policies because the Great Depression was so bad, but we're not going to do that yet. After this, you'll study a bit more of how did people experience these bad conditions of the Great Depression that really formed a whole depression mentality and generation of these people today that are, well, they're mostly dead at this point, but they lived through a very, very difficult time, and it judged how they then ran their lives for the rest of their lives. All right, you'll be seeing that next. All right, folks, thank you for watching. So, remember, keep up with all the videos that I'm posting on Google Classroom, the directions, the debriefs, and doing the activities in between. This is one of the 2 lectures for this unit. It's setting up the causes, which is your first essential question. So it sets up where we will go from here. All right, folks, so see you later. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.